Well, thanks everybody for coming. Today we're very happy to welcome Jennifer Iverson. Dr. Iverson is an assistant professor of music theory from the University of Iowa, and this year she's an external faculty fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center. For everybody who's watching online, thank you for coming too. If you have any questions for Dr. Iverson, you can post them in the comments section, and it will be relayed to her at an opportune moment. Dr. Iverson is a 20th century music scholar, and today her talk is entitled Invisible Collaboration, the Dawn of Electronic Music at the WDR, or AIR, am I saying it correctly? WDR, and she'll be talking in particular about the very earliest pieces of music to come out of that studio in Cologne in 1952 and 1953. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Iverson.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Madeline, and thank you all for the invitation to share my work. It's quite an honor to be speaking at one of the foremost computer music research centers in the entire world, so I'm really excited to be here today. Technology pervades society, art, and culture in the 1950s, provoking both excitement and anxiety. Wartime technologies, from rockets and satellites to early computers and noise generators, needed to be domesticated and tamed. This technological domestication is performed in industry, institutions, art, and culture in the 1950s as an antidote to Germany's lowest point. Stunde Null, or 0 hour, means something different to everyone. And depending on generation, geography, identity, and personal experiences, it's difficult to speak about. Post-war cities were literally destroyed, and Germans contended with too little food, skyrocketing inflation, and grief that was both personal and cultural. The Allies' uneven process of denazification sidestepped a deep engagement with the Holocaust, but charted a path of cultural re-education. One of the most famous and resilient of these Cold War-era re-education initiatives is the Darmstadt Ferienkurs für Neue Musik. Here, pan-European musicians, composers, and impresarios gathered for 2 weeks every summer to listen, analyze, discuss, and share their own music. Musicologists have long recognized that the Darmstadt summer courses were a catalytic environment, but have largely said that the young composers, despite their shared interest in serialism, are not actually a coherent group. Their styles are too disparate and their polemical disagreements are too fierce. But what if we also look at other institutions that nurtured new music? I argue that the electronic music studio at the Westdeutsche Rundfunk in Cologne, the West German Radio, or WDR, is a much better locus for studying this group of composers. One cannot overstate the importance of radio stations as cultural actors in this post-war era. Cologne emerged as a new music center because it funded a number of key initiatives. Imert's very popular nighttime serial broadcasts that analyzed new music, the Musikalisches Nachtprogramm, the new music concert series, Musik der Zeit, Music of the Time, and of course, the anticipated electronic music studio. There's more than a dose of Cold War competition folded into this scene. WDR administrators in Cologne were keen to distinguish themselves locally from the Hamburg branch of the NWDR, of which they were still officially a part until 1956. Regionally, from the Southwest German Radio in the formerly French zone, continentally, from Pierre Schaeffer's Paris Musique Concrète studio, and internationally, from studios that were sure to be built any minute in the USA. My paper today excavates to show networks of collaborators working together at the WDR Electronic Music Studio in Cologne. In this photograph, we see the composer Gottfried Michael Koenig on the left and Herbert Imert, the studio founder and composer, on the right. But who are these two in the middle? My work focuses our attention on the invisible collaborators, the technicians, administrators, promoters, and scientists who make the creative work of the composer possible. I'm certainly not the first to remark upon collaborative production. Consider the producer's contributions to a pop rock album, or the film music composer underwritten by a team of orchestrators, producers, and directors, or the largely hidden work of programmers in a Silicon Valley tech firm. My intellectual orientation toward networks and collaboration is informed by Bruno Latour's work, which has laid bare the hierarchies, roles, and power dynamics that characterize the scientific laboratory. I'm also indebted to the careful and insightful ethnography of Georgina Bourne, who has had much to say about EarCom and the Electronic Music Studio as a locus of collaborative production. It's crucial that most of these collaborative scenarios are deeply ingrained with new or creative uses of technology. As I will show, the technologies themselves presented significant hurdles to composers of electronic music. A collaborative working environment was needed in many cases, at least until the composer made some progress on his steep learning curve. The electronic music studio was compelling, but also sometimes slow and frustrating. There were large gaps between what could be imagined and what could be practically composed. My work also shows that the ideas of the electronic music studio, for these practical reasons, were taken up in acoustic music. This is something I'll focus on less today, but it's a central theme of the book that I'm writing. Composers like Boulez and Stockhausen and Ligeti have crafted their own legacies with a deliberate rhetoric of autonomy. That's Charles Wilson's phrase. And musicologists have been all too eager to go along. My work problematizes this 19th and 20th century idea of the autonomous genius composer who develops and realizes his ideas in solitude by showing networks of collaborators. Composers often gathered together at the WDR studio during long stays. And when they didn't meet in person, they shared many passionate first and second-hand accounts of electronic music in their letters. Their correspondence was continual. It really extended far past the annual Darmstadt meetings every summer. And I really like to look at the letters because it gets us underneath the sort of overheated polemics that sometimes blew up at Darmstadt. So over the year and in constant communication, we can see composers working out their collaborations, their uncertainties, year-round, really. So in summary, I think the WDR is an ideal site to study the reclaiming of post-war technologies and their application in both electronic and acoustic music. My paper today is in 3 parts. In the first part, we'll learn that the founders imagined the studio as a timbral utopia. And then we have 2 case studies that excavate to make the work of collaborators visible and audible. In the first case study, you'll hear about the studio's Piece Zero and about the working relationships between the composers Eimert and Beyer and their technician Heinz Schütz. In the second case study, I show how Stockhausen and Passur worked with the scientist Meyer Epler to refine additive synthesis. The aesthetic evolution of the studio in the 1950s was, in many ways, engineer-driven. It's going to take me about 50 minutes, probably, just so you have an expectation. So let's turn now to the studio's foundations. In 1951, Eimert, Beyer, and Meyer Epler convinced administrators at the Northwest German Radio that an electronic music studio was essential for scientific and aesthetic research and development. Okay, so on the left you have Eimert. You've already seen him. In addition to being a composer and a studio founder, he was a PhD musicologist. He wrote one of the first treatises on atonal music and was an early proponent of atonal and 12-tone composition. He also worked as a music critic and for a long time, actually, for a couple of different Cologne publications. So he was very attuned to issues of audience perception and reception and was a prolific writer as a critic. So he has multiple facets. Meyer Epler is his close collaborator, one of the studio founders. He's really not a musician, but he's musically curious. He's a physicist whose primary expertise lies in acoustics, and he's trained and also working at the University of Bonn during his entire career. So that's just right up the road from Cologne. He's a crucial knowledge base for the younger generation of composers, including Stockhausen and Kagel and others, but he's also crucial in the early years in developing the technologies and the discourses of this studio. He's understood as a foremost exponent of information theory in Germany at this age, and his research in phonetics was crucial both in wartime broadcasting technologies and in electronic music after the war. So he's really absolutely essential figure. Robert Beyer is the third studio founder, and he doesn't have a biographer. He threatens to kind of disappear from the historical record entirely. We don't know very much about his life. He's a composer and a sound engineer who worked primarily in film. He worked for the German film production company Tobis in the Weimar era, and then he completely falls off the map, or we don't yet know what he did during the war. Then he becomes a sound engineer at the WDR after the war and gets associated with Meyer-Epler and Eimert and makes some of the first works together with Eimert, then leaves the studio in '53. So he's rather enigmatic. And I tried to make him visible in this paper, but one can only make him so visible. We need more archival material and more biography for Beyer. Okay, so the physical space of the studio wasn't finished until early 1953, but these three co-founders sketched the studio's aesthetic foundations in numerous articles, Darmstadt lectures, and broadcasts between 1950 and '52. All three historicized the development of electronic music, highlighting the innovations of Busoni, Schoenberg, and Webern, while simultaneously arguing that traditional orchestral instruments limited composers to known timbres, existing instrumental combinations, fixed notation, and equal-tempered tuning systems. Idealistically, electronic music offered the ability to escape from these traditional shackles and to deal directly with timbre for the first time. As Meyer-Epler said in 1950, quote, "Our musical instruments exist in a Gordian knot between instrumental form and timbre, in which it is impossible to produce a connection from one timbre to another. What lies, for example, sonically in the middle between clarinet and oboe? There's no continuous pathway. This cannot be managed until one allows electricity to help. An analogy would be color in painting. Earlier, we had natural colors, few tones, and choices committed not by artists, but given by chance. Now we have aniline, that is, chemically formulated colors, and free compositional possibilities." Eimert shared this enthusiasm. Quote, "For the first time, the sonic material shows itself in its true limitlessness. The idea of boundless sonic material is an age-old musical dream. This is not about fantasies of the future. Instead, this first task is as concrete as it is difficult. Anfangen, let's begin." The unspoken political stakes are perhaps clear, because both the Nazis and now the socialist realists were artistically conservative. The only position that was morally acceptable was on the avant-garde. The progressive post-war composers believed that aesthetic innovation, especially by embracing electronic technology, was both their birthright and their ethical obligation. But Eimert and Meyer-Epler were overly optimistic about the new timbral utopia. Here's the beginning of an early Eimert experiment, Spiel for Mellochord. So maybe not quite a timbral utopia yet, right? As early as 1952, even studio founder Robert Beyer admits, quote, "The expectations for the realization of a new sound world have not yet been fulfilled." Beyer, having come from a background in film, is much more interested in tape editing techniques than in new electronic instruments like the Mellochord that you just saw. Beyer believes that montage techniques will lead to remarkable advances in both the timbral and the spatial aspects of the sound. For Beyer, aesthetics depend on the technology. Quote, "One no longer imagines the equipment as a modestly played reproduction from a ready-made instrument, but rather as a free arrangement of electroacoustic procedures in the way that's common in research laboratories. In other words, the technological in its whole breadth is implicated in the realization process." If the goal was to create a whole new timbral palette, and if this goal was in reach for the first time because of the new technology, then the aesthetics had to grow out of the technologies themselves. Beyer is quite prescient in his observation that the studio will be structured like a research laboratory. As the studio co-founders would quickly find out, a host of technical collaborators would be necessary to advance the studio's research paradigm and help the composers make palatable new artistic works. So in this 1954 photograph, we've said that Koenig and Eimert are on the outsides. The two technicians in the middle are Erhard Hafner and Heinz Schütz. Both had close ties to the radio play division. As Gottfried Michael Koenig explained when he began at the WDR in 1954, Hafner then went to the radio play division, and I took his place more or less. There was always work to do with the visiting composers. Schütz alone was not always the right person because he came from radio technique and was of little help to composers who wanted to discuss musical problems during the work." End quote. Hafner and Schütz were more accustomed to producing sound effects for Hörspiel, the popular radio play dramas, than assisting visiting composers who were making abstract, serious art music. The Hörspiel orientation was problematic for exactly the same reasons as Musik concrète. Sound effects were an insubstantial and impoverished use of the new technology. In contrast to Schaeffer's Paris studio, Eimert gave the visiting composers at the WDR free creative rein. The irony is that the electronic technologies themselves, the sine tone generators, tape recorders, filters, speakers, and instruments, were still very much a mystery. This made composers highly dependent on the technicians and engineers who could handle the machines, as Born also observed was the case at IRCAM in the 1980s. Eimert and his collaborators, and I'm sorry, I'm going to continue to use the male pronoun here because these are all guys. Eimert and his collaborators deeply wanted to explore a timbral utopia, but found themselves in reality asking their technicians to produce sound effects on unwieldy electronic instruments. As Stockhausen complained to his best friend, the French-Belgian composer Henri Pousseur, quote, "My situation is becoming difficult. Eimert is composing again and has limited my time to 3 hours daily. I believe he hates me and my music. I need music and this work and a technician who does not laugh at me because he can easily sell radio play noises." End quote. Stockhausen puts Eimert's compositional activity in scare quotes, disparaging the sound effects that he associates with the technician Schütz. At this moment in October 1953, Eimert and Schütz are at work on a serious new electronic piece, probably the Etude über Tongemische, which explored the same questions of inharmonic additive synthesis that preoccupied Stockhausen at this time. Despite this, Stockhausen seems to believe that Eimert's only appropriating the pop art sound effects of Hörspiel drama. As we will see, this is because Eimert seems to have freely incorporated the creative and technical help of his main engineer, Heinz Schütz. In 2008, RCA released a never-before-heard piece produced at the WDR studio in Cologne. Appropriately titled Morgenröte, or Dawn, is Piece 0, the first piece of experimental electronic music composed at the WDR in late 1952 by Schütz, who was employed there as an audio engineer from 1951 to 58. If such a Piece 0 existed, why did it wait over 50 years to be heard? At a time when making electronic music was slow and difficult, why wasn't Morgenröte premiered at Neues Musikfest Köln on May 26, 1953, along with the newest electronic works by Herbert Eimert, Robert Beyer, and Pierre Schaeffer? So you have this concert program, and it's the first German premiere of Elektronische Musik on your handout as figure 1. So today, we have the luxury of time. Let's listen to the whole piece. It's about 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. I invite you to follow along with the formal outline, if you like, or simply pay close attention to the unfolding of the various sound effects. Morgenröte by Heinz Schütz. So Morgenröte wasn't actually premiered. But when we listened to the 4 pieces shown in Figure 1, we learned that it was heard on that first 1953 concert, in a way. Morgenröte's sonic materials turn out to be the foundation for all of Eimert and Bayer's pieces on that program, Klangstudie 2 and Klang in unbegrenzten Raum, which means sound in unbounded space, appropriately. I'll call this piece KUR. You may now want to have a look at Figures 2 and 3 in your handout, where you can see the formal outlines and charts comparing the sonic material between the 3 pieces. If you haven't already, it's fine if you have. Given the similarities in their sonic materials, we can infer that Eimert and Bayer repurposed Morgenröte, some might say cannibalized, to create Klangstudie 2, which was then truncated and recontextualized as the 3rd movement of KUR. As Figure 3 shows, Morgenröte is also the foundation for movements 1 and 2 of KUR, but I won't discuss this today. Figure 3 is somewhat supplementary in your handout. I don't have it on a slide, but you're welcome to refer to it to the extent that you like to match the letters in the formal diagrams with the motives and so on. So let's now listen to the opening passage of Klangstudie 2, this passage right here. Piece by Eimert and Bayer. Showcases timbral transformations on a sound that I think you will remember from Morgenröte. Did you hear it? The siren-like sliding major triad is one of the piece's most recognizable gestures. The timbrally varied repetitions that open the sound study, Klangstudie 2, show Eimert and Bayer at pains to disguise their anxiety over sound effects. Eimert and Bayer tried to give a more sophisticated rendering of the material, where repetitions are always colored by the timbral variation that was supposed to be the new frontier. This kind of timbral variation was easy to produce on the mellochord. The dual manual keyboard connected to a tone generator, which could produce sine tones as well as overtone-rich sounds. One could vary the timbre of the generated sounds by way of various tunable filters, noise generators, and ring modulators installed on the instrument. Schütz, Eimert, and Bayer could have used the mellochord sound filters to add reverberations, a vibrato generator or a low-frequency oscillator, perhaps, to produce a frequency between 6 and 8 hertz that would modify the generated tones, and an envelope regulator to deploy particular attack and decay characteristics. As we've already established, timbre was very much in the forefront of the composer's imaginations, and the mellochord was particularly well suited to timbral variation. But what did Eimert and Bayer really appropriate from Schütz? The way of using the mellochord? Individual sounds? The whole piece? The answers are a little bit of all 3. There's one 30-second section of the piece that Eimert and Bayer have appropriated nearly wholesale from Morgenröte. These graphic scores seek to represent the sonic elements in the mixture and also attempt to render the chronological unfolding over the excerpts. So the graphic scores are my analytical representation. No notation or sketch material exists for any of these pieces. So this is all just a sort of analytical visual representation of my heard analysis. The gray shading around motives, as you see happening in some places signifies more reverberation. So I'm going to play now these two excerpts back to back. You'll hear the Morgenrothe excerpt first, and then a short pause in the Klangstudie excerpt. Maybe I actually have to click to play Klangstudie. So I won't belabor the similarities. Changes in contour and register are probably a result of tape editing techniques such as reversing tape directions or slowing or speeding the tape, which induces pitch transpositions, as you know. In other cases, like the excerpt that we heard from the beginning of Klangstudie 2, Eimert and Beyer treat Morgenrothe's materials more as a sound catalog, more as sonic raw material that can be detached, further processed, and recombined. We should note, however, that Eimert and Beyer's timbrally varied repetitions extend rather than completely overthrow the compositional logic already inherent in Schutz's piece. Morgenrothe has a beginning, middle, end structure with motives that develop over the course of the piece. All of the sonic materials are presented in the first 47 or so seconds, when the piece then begins to develop and dwell on motives individually for longer periods of time. The piece ends with a return to the drone motive, which produces a formal rounding off. All of these elements are seemingly evidence of compositional design, even if rather hastily construed. In interview, Schutz said that Morgenrothe was only a beginning, composed with primitive means as quickly as possible. Quote, "Since I produced it, it is associated with me. I do not see myself as a composer. Pure chance." End quote. In other words, Morgenrothe was probably never imagined as a finished piece, but as a mock-up, a provisional demonstration of the studio's existing technology and sound possibilities. Earlier in 1952, when Stockhausen was working as an intern in Pierre Schaeffer's Paris studio, Eimert wrote to him, quote, "Meyer Epler compiled a catalog of sound types for me, 12, 24, or 48, which one should be able to compose with, just as one does with 12 tones. Of course, one needs to have the sounds exactly in one's mind first. Then one can apply the 12-tone technique. Composing is rhythmicizing, which in reality means a laborious process of tape tailoring. After long considerations, I believe that there is no other way out at our current level of technology." End quote. Eimert's description of his compositional imagination seems to depart little from de rigueur dodecaphony, and his technical ability seems to be limited to montage techniques, that is, to rhythmicizing events by measuring their duration and splicing tape. It's likely that Morgenrothe was intended as this kind of sound catalog, meant to be repurposed into other works. So there's no evidence of hand-wringing over whether Schutz's creative voice was marginalized, as Morgenrothe was deconstructed, repurposed, and reconstructed again and again. Schutz and Eimert seem to view their roles as cooperative and mutually reinforcing, but neither more or less important than the other. All of this says nothing of Beyer's specific contributions to the compositional process, which remain obscure. Even if technicians and composers insist their collaborations are pragmatic and harmonious, there's good reason to be skeptical of perpetual power imbalances. When it comes to the premiere, the only people credited for the creative work are Eimert and Beyer. The contributions of Schutz and other technicians remain less visible or invisible, even if technicians were complicit in this elision. Eimert and Beyer publicly bolster their authority as composers, underwritten by the false assumption that to compose in the electronic studio involves similar work as in acoustic music. In showcasing the Morgenrothe materials in their second and third iterations in that May 1953 concert as their own, Eimert strengthened his position as the public face of the studio. Not only was he the studio's advocate, its creative director, and its technical manager, he was also its leading composer. Lastly, we should be attentive to the difficulty and the importance of creating the sounds. In his contemporaneous writings, Eimert says that creating the sounds is not really the work of the composer, it's the work of the technician. The composer is then responsible to logically develop these basic materials. It's deeply ironic that the avant-garde composers were so uniformly excited to create a timbral utopia in the studio, but were simultaneously ill-equipped to do so. Controlling timbre, their greatest dream, now depended on multiple instrument builders and technicians. And yet, precisely because the technician's work could be subsumed, Eimert and other composers continued to promulgate the rhetoric of new sonic frontiers and total timbral control. The repurposing of Morgenrothe reveals an invisible collaboration that's rather parasitic in flavor. Eimert and Bayer seem to have freely appropriated the work of their engineer Schütz, with no apparent regard for his own nascent creative work. My second case study, which involves Stockhausen, Passeur, and Meyer-Epler, reveals a more symbiotic mode of collaborative working. When Stockhausen and Heuerwerts began working in the studio in 1953, the first of the young composers to do so, they quickly moved away from electronic instruments like the mellochord and toward additive synthesis using sine tone generators and tape. So you all know what additive synthesis is. Maybe for the benefit of my audience, virtual audience, I'll just explain it real quickly. In additive synthesis, one can use evenly spaced sine tone partials to create harmonic mixtures, which tend to mimic acoustic or natural sounds. And one composer to work in this way was an architect who composed one piece. His name is Paul Gredinger, and he wrote a piece that was entirely based on timbral transformation of harmonic additive synthesis sounds. So here's an example. So you hear, for instance, some string-like sounds, even though those were totally electronically synthesized, using pretty primitive technology. So one can, of course, also create inharmonic mixtures by using partials that are unevenly spaced. Inharmonic mixtures tend to create new or synthetic timbres because the sine tone partials are not all related to a single fundamental. Stockhausen worked this way first in Studier 1, and I'll play a short excerpt. Stockhausen believed additive synthesis was an ideal way to build interesting timbres. As he said, quote, "We return to the element on which all sonic variation is based, the pure wave, which one can electronically generate and which one calls the sine tone. Every existing sound, every noise is a mixture of such sine tones. We call it a spectrum. Number, interval, and volume relationships between such sine tones account for the individual character of each spectrum. They determine timbre." End quote. The composers who were working in the studio in 1953 and 54 were collaborating to develop and advance additive synthesis. All of their pieces premiered together at the Musik der Zeit concert in October of 1954. And likewise, these pieces are all closely related conceptually. The composers all deal with proportions, and they all wrangle with the question of harmonic or inharmonic mixtures. The inharmonic approach, as we've said, is one that Stockhausen experimented with during the composition of Studier 1. Stockhausen uses a series of 5 ratios involving the integers 4, 5, 8, and 12 to govern a 6-frequency mixture. So in his sketch here, the 5 to 8 proportion is included for logical consistency, but Stockhausen doesn't use it because he's got a serial scheme that permutes a 6-frequency mixture. Stockhausen's sine tone partials are logically derived. They're all proportional, but they're not all overtones from a single fundamental. When Stockhausen shared Studie 1 with his best friend and fellow composer Pussur in late 1953, they were both dissatisfied that the mixtures tended to sound more like chords than timbres. I'm going to replay that same excerpt from Studie 1 so you can listen again for this problem of chords rather than a sort of synthetic timbre. As Pussur pointed out to Stockhausen in a letter, the inharmonic mixtures that Stockhausen used for Studie 1 do have quite a few resonances with harmonic spectra. The ratios create the intervals minor 10th, major 3rd, and minor 6th. Pussur writes that the 6 proportional overtones of the mixture, shown as the real tones on top of the line, 384, 160, 200, and so on, these can be heard as producing a, quote, common, audible, continued fundamental tone, end quote. Pussur's illustration shows his logic. One can continue the process of relating frequencies by ratios if one considers the proportional relationships between the lowest common factors in each ratio. The proportion between frequencies 384 and 160 is 12 to 5. The factor 32 unites these two integers. That is, 32 times 12 is 384, and 32 times 5 is 160. And likewise, this logic applies across the first row of frequencies. Pussur then points out that having derived a second row of frequencies from the lowest common factors, the middle proportions in the series, namely 4 to 5, 8 to 5, and 5 to 12, are preserved. Continuing his derivation of factors and proportions into a third and finally a fourth line, Pussur shows that a stratified proportional scheme can be thought to underlie the 6 overtone mixture. It's true that the frequencies below the line are imaginary, and in fact those below about 20 hertz would be inaudible as pitches. Pussur derives them logically by continuing the proportional scheme amongst the factors. But even though the frequencies below the line are imaginary, he argues to Stockhausen that they will be heard in the music as combination tones. In a second illustration, Pussur tries to show why this might be the case. He arranges all of these frequencies, both the actual mixture frequencies and the possible combination tones, vertically, to show Stockhausen all of the harmonic relationships that inhere between the frequencies. The combination tones must be audible, he argues, because they are reinforced with octave and fifth relationships. Stockhausen was having trouble with the perceptual fusion of his mixtures. He wanted timbres, but he was getting chords. Stockhausen's problem was not really one of harmonicity, as Pussur thought, but rather one of complexity. As you know, the perceptual fusion of the mixture in the listener's brain is extraordinarily complex. It depends not only on proportions and dynamic levels between partials, but also on attack and decay envelopes, reverberation, and many other factors. As Stockhausen says to Pussur, it does not seem possible to produce sophisticated timbres using additive synthesis alone. Quote, spectra change at every moment. Partial tones arise, abate, and change in volume. End quote. Stuck at this impasse, Stockhausen began to study with Meyer-Epler in Bonn. As you remember, Meyer-Epler was a studio founder, PhD scientist with expertise in acoustics and psychoacoustics, phonetics, technical aspects of electronic equipment, and information theory. In his important 1949 book, Elektrische Klangerzeugung, electric sound production, Meyer-Epler presents the musical implications of his phonetics research. Following from Helmholtz and Stumpf, Meyer-Epler shows that vowels and consonants exist on a continuum from pitch tone to colored noise. Vowels produce a relatively pure timbre, a pitched fundamental plus overtones that change based on the positioning of the vowel in the mouth and the resonance in the sinus cavities. So I have a little archival sound example here that shows how vowel timbres can be varied, which is what Meyer-Epler is showing visually in this example from his book. Okay, so that's vowels. Consonants, on the other hand, make a larger range of sounds, depending on whether they're pitched in the vocal cords or not, how they're shaped by the lips, and so on. So Meyer-Epler also had a lot to say about consonants and their variation in terms of the frequency and overtone spectrums that one could expect from them. I have a little audio excerpt here as well. It's not totally clear. This is also archival sound. It's not totally clear what this is. Meyer-Epler worked with the vocoder, which was Bell Labs' piece of machinery that actually was developed to encode and decode wartime communication technologies. So one could make faux synthesized speech that could only be decoded by the same machine. But Meyer-Epler began to use this machine to synthesize speech in the post-war era and to study the timbre of speech and these timbral changes. So it's not clear whether this example uses the vocoder or not. It may. I'll leave it at that.
Church, dead, shirts. Dead, dead, dead. Church, dead, shirts. Dead, dead, dead.
All right. So consonants exist on a continuum from almost vowel-like to noisy and percussive. Meyer-Epler's research suggested to many of the young composers, including Stockhausen and Kagel in particular, that electronic sounds can move along a similar continuum. In this way, knowledge of timbre and phonetics can be used to manipulate overtone spectra in electronic music. As Stockhausen writes to Pasteur, quote, "The ideal tone form about which you speak is white or colored noise, a spectral band. Think of the consonants T, S, F, P, etc. in our language. Bells, metal, etc. Water. The combination tones do not help you. You continue to expect separate different frequencies, but still single ones, even if there are more." Stockhausen's new perspective, which privileges the complexity of noise, extends directly from his studies with Meyer-Epler. Though the WDR composers generally did not use spectral analysis in their work, Meyer-Epler's phonetics research did produce visible sound spectra, which must have given Stockhausen a much more concrete idea of the complexity of sounds over time. It's clear that Stockhausen understands the usefulness of spectral analysis when he asks, quote, "If one reverses the analytical process temporally, can waveforms be synthetically produced from the analytical data?" These psychoacoustic, perceptual questions were taken up by Stockhausen as he built the sounds for Studio 2. Inharmonic mixtures of 5 partial tones with dynamic levels for each partial. And then he also went further to modify each mixture with ad hoc versions of the factors that he knew to affect timbral fusion. He used ambient reverberation on each mixture, playing a looped mixture in a room and re-recording it, because it creates an overlap in the onset of and progression of the sound that's particularly helpful for approximating a more complex spectral evolution. He then applied dynamics to each mixture by turning knobs during playback to make volume envelopes. You can see those volume envelopes on the bottom of the score here. Tape lengths are in the middle, and the frequency mixtures are on the top. Those were devised according to a serial scheme that was proportional. So we're just going to listen to an excerpt from Studio 2 now, and this is one of the only electronic pieces from this era that has a score. It's both a realization score and a nice visual representation of what you'll hear. So I'm sure you'll be able to follow right along. Stockhausen had ample opportunity to experiment with these ad hoc adjustments like volume curves as he realized Pasteur's seismograms 1 and 2. Pessoa, being a school teacher, was unable to come to the WDR studio for a long stay in 1954, despite being extraordinarily interested to do so. Stockhausen realized Pessoa's sketches for an electronic piece, reporting on his experiments to him by letter. Quote, "In the future, we should consider the envelope curves more as a statistical phenomena, as a higher order group of microscopic changes in volume, in dependence upon the smallest unit of time, in which there can appear just a few continuous evolutionary movements as patterns, as it is with pitch and duration, where it is clear that one would never permit chromatic scales." End quote. So let's listen to just a short excerpt of Pessoa's seismograms, composed almost contemporaneously. So you can really hear them working with these volume curves here. You have a lot of these sounds that are like these really kind of harsh, fast crescendos. In realizing his own Studie 2 and Pessoa's seismograms, Stockhausen has just begun the approximating that he will later call statistical form. I think this is the beginning of that thread. Statistical form approximates a general direction rather than explicitly managing every single factor in the mixture. Koenig and Stockhausen widely applied these approximating techniques during the realization of Gesang der Jünglinge in 1955 and 56. But in 1954, the idea of making pragmatic technical compromises was in its infancy. Composers learned from each other's experiments and dissatisfactions and found that they needed to know much more, not only about the studio's technology, but also about acoustics and perception. Here, the teachings of Meyer-Epler were crucial. Stockhausen and Pessoa's dissatisfactions drove them to further experimentation, especially toward using statistically approximated curves to enhance fusion. I hope to have shown today that the WDR studio was a crucial site where the main tenets of mid-century serial thought evolved. The multiple incarnations of Morgenrothe sublimate the composer's sound effects anxiety and increasingly try to construe electronic music as serious music. The founder's early lectures idealistically imagined a timbral utopia that would extend beyond instruments. But in the studio, timbral innovation was difficult. As Stockhausen, Pessoa, and others learned more about psychoacoustics, especially from collaborating scientist Meyer-Epler, their compositional preoccupations turned to creating timbres between the poles of harmonicity and white noise. It is here, in the electronic studio, that proportions and continuums become the defining features of serial thought. Likewise, technological limitations spurred composers to embrace statistical compromises. It is in these ways that the innovations and the techniques of the WDR studio drove acoustic music. My analysis today has striven to make visible and audible a collaborative network that enabled the creative work of the studio. I've shown that the WDR studio operated as a science and technology laboratory where ideas were constantly shared. Many of the so-called Darmstadt composers met and corresponded with each other, and also with scientists, technicians, and administrators who helped them refine, advance, and promote their creative works. I've excavated an apparently harmonious but hierarchical collaboration between Schütz, Eimert, and Bayer. I've also revealed a more egalitarian exchange between Stockhausen, Pessoa, and Meyer-Epler. Composers benefited from the technical expertise of their invisible collaborators in both scenarios, to be sure. But it was not only a matter of technician as nurse. In many cases, exchanges of expertise and creativity flowed in both directions. These networks of collaboration have deep impacts on our understanding of the Darmstadt School. Lastly, I hope to have shown today that technology mediates artistic work. The birth and evolution of the WDR studio is deeply bound up with the project of reclaiming wartime technologies. Meyer-Epler's eagerness to reuse the vocoder, his phonetics research and information theory for musical aims is but one prime example. It's no coincidence that the not sound effects of the earliest WDR pieces like Morgenrothe and Klangstudie 2 are strikingly similar to the soundtrack for the sci-fi space film, The Forbidden Planet. Technology is the link between high art and popular uses of electronic sound. Aesthetic genealogies only take us so far. We know that the Beach Boys and the Beatles used electronic music, but the story is far more engaging when we delve deeply into the technologies themselves, their potentials and limitations, the industrial conditions of their production, distribution, and use. So thank you for listening to my excavations of the invisible collaborations at the WDR. I look forward to our conversation.
Questions or comments for Dr. Anderson?
I'm reminded of Max Matthews, who obviously a huge figure here at CCRMA, who in the 50s made a very broad claim that I was looking for the quote, but I have to paraphrase, that the computer can produce any sound audible by the human ear, and this timbral utopia as you discussed, and then later in life he came up with a corollary that almost all of them are ugly, painful, useless, etc.
Yeah, I too am shocked by the way that, I don't want to make like a broad brush assumption about your work here at CCRMA and like what interests you all, or what interests the composers who work at EarCom, for instance. But I'm really shocked at the degree to which this whole timbral utopia idea, like, really engages composers throughout the latter half of the 20th century, right? And I think it's arguable, you guys can tell me if you think this is right. I think it's arguable that in computer music today, people are still working for that dream of timbral synthesis and total timbral control that Eimert and his collaborators articulated in 1950. And I think that's quite remarkable. Certainly they didn't foresee at the time how difficult it would be. And Max Matthews' comment speaks to that as well, right? There's this sort of utopian flavor around the potentialities of the studio and then the sort of new potentialities of the computer, right? And all of this turns out to be a lot more difficult, whether we're talking about analog technology or computer music, a lot more difficult than was originally imagined. Yeah, Dave?
I've got a question from online, from somebody, Jonathan Wilson. He says, I'm just quoting directly, "Hello, Dr. Iverson. Question on Heinz Schutz's creative work from the 50s. Do you know if Schutz wrote or created any other works or take pieces of this length on his own from the early to mid-50s?"
Great question, Jonathan. We also don't know very much about Heinz Schutz. There's one interview in one book, and that's the interview that I quoted from. It's like a paragraph long, very short. Of course, Schutz only worked at the studio between 51 and 58. And I've done archival research at the WDR, but none of his work or his notes or any sort of record of him really is preserved there, at least as far as I can find. So we know very little about Schutz. We have that one interview and we have Morgan Rutte. It's not thought that he produced any other pieces, but of course he could have. It's hard to say. I hope that Morgan Rutte is a vivid example of how these kinds of collaborations could have gone, and Schutz could have had a lot more to do with other pieces that are also attributed to Eimert. He was an engineer who worked primarily with Eimert. If we wanted to know more about Schutz's work, we would look at the radio play dramas, and we would look at the sound effects and the soundtracks that were produced for those radio play dramas. I think that really was Schutz's main orientation and the place where we'd really be able to home in on his creative output, as it were. But I don't think that he really produced another piece after Morgan Rutte, at least not explicitly.
One comment and one question. So the idea of the timbral utopia goes back a little bit further, even into the 19th century. And everybody is always searching for this kind of, euphonia, sort of, or even a Wagnerian kind of idea of like expanding the possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting that when, it's like when people are like, oh, we finally got it, even though it doesn't quite work out that way.
Yeah.
That there's and there's already two aesthetic differences within a couple of years make themselves really clear. The first one obviously being the French idea of like concrete sound, and the German idea of kind of like using electronics. But even within then the German ideal, within 1 year, you have this jump from an older generation and a newer generation completely rejecting the work so quickly. It's just remarkable how quick it turns over, that they're looking for something else. You know, they don't ultimately find it, but they are going, no, that's not how you do it, we should do that. I just find that kind of, quite interesting.
Yeah, I think so too. Can I just comment on that before you ask your second question? One thing I've really been surprised by in my archival research, in my reading of these historical sources, is that Meyer Epler and Eimert and Beyer really posit the same logic for the studio based on this timbral utopia, based on the inevitability of this historical progression, this dream of sort of total control. They really are using these terms, you know, before Stockhausen et al., right? Or at least contemporaneously with Stockhausen and Nono and so forth, as they're working out their ideas at Darmstadt with regard to Webern's music, right? So the studio was founded with the same logic that Stockhausen and others will use to promulgate their own works a few years later, right? But you're right that Stockhausen in particular sort of had to put his elbows out and make space for himself and reject the compositions of Eimert. And, you know, on aesthetic terms, I think one can see why he did that, right? So there's a sort of continuity of thought, but a sort of elbowing out and killing of the father a little bit that's happening there as well. It's very political, kind of turbulent relationship between those two.
It's pretty quick.
Yeah, indeed.
The other question was if you've come across within the letters any comments about the horse feelings, particularly the pre-war. I can't remember the name of the book offhand. There was a study on, I can't remember his name now, someone who sort of had to disappear under the Nazis. He'd done a lot of experiments into feedback and using strange electronics in the pieces so that they were sound effects, but they seemed to be interested in the idea of something between the pitches. Do the guys ever talk about like things they heard when they were younger? Not just the stuff, like I'm talking about the younger generation, Brazil and Stockhausen. Is there any?
Oh, that's a great connection, and that's a complete subtext as far as I can tell. I've never seen one of the younger composers talk about Hörspiel or talk about it as innovative. And I wonder if this isn't, you know, kind of in this Freudian sense, like because it was like so close to what they were doing and was using the same technologies and was actually working with the same kinds of sounds, it had to sort of be sublimated and suppressed, right? I mean, that's kind of my interpretation of that. I'm not so knowledgeable about Hörspiel. Cage, for instance, produced Hörspiel scores, but this is an aspect that I'm just getting into, again, because it's like a subtext that one has to read between the lines. But I love the idea that Stockhausen and others were growing up in an era where they would have heard this, these radio play dramas and heard these sound effects and perhaps been intrigued by these sounds before and exposed to these sounds before they began working with them. I guess we also need to know more about what Hörspiel was like in the Nazi era, if it existed, when it stopped, because at some point, you know, I'm sure just pragmatically wartime broadcasting minimized the sort of entertainment function, and whether it was as experimental as it was in the post-war years.
There seemed to be something I only briefly read a book about it, that there was a very experimental trend just up to 1933. And obviously most of that was destroyed, so everything is going on reports. I'm just wondering what reports they have.
Yeah.
But an interesting comparison is that there is, because Third Man, Citizen Kane, Orson Welles, there is comparisons of Orson Welles, say, from War Worlds, talking about previous radio shows he heard as a kid and the idea of how you would make a hoax. His interest in sound effects and his interest in something that's beyond the musical effects. I'm just wondering if it's a pity, because it's Orson Welles, there's more interviews and
more material.
Same with these guys, they must have some memory or some idea.
Yeah, well, Stockhausen was born in 1928, and others in his generation at a similar time. Ligeti slightly older, for instance, but growing up in Hungary. So, I think if Hörspiel stopped when the Nazis came to power in the mid-30s, then Stockhausen would have been very young, right? Eimert, on the other hand, though, was born in 1897, and Meyer-Epler shortly after that. So, you know, around the turn of the century, this older generation really is sort of a generation older, and they would have had much more experience with. And in fact, Eimert is a composer of Hörspiel scores too. This is another thing that like has to be rooted out. It's sort of something that I'm working on right now. But they were very much, the older generation were very much exposed to this and perhaps even working in this way, right? But really at pains to disguise that when it came to this high art, post-war serious research and development of electronic music, right?
Another question from online from somebody about Solomon Fenton Miller. He asks, just curious, how much of the original equipment and original recordings survive? And were you able to see any of these materials?
Thank you, Solomon, for that question. The original equipment of the VDR doesn't survive or isn't available in a museum-like situation. I was able to see some of this analog equipment at the Institute for Sonology. Kees Tasselaar is quite an expert. He's a composer. I'm sure you guys know him. He's a composer. He's a wonderful scholar of electronic music as well, and he runs the Institute for Sonology in the Netherlands. And so he has sort of a wonderful collection that's just privately curated. He also has an analog studio where one can continue to work with analog compositional techniques there, and that's quite interesting to me. The VDR has
some of the same equipment as had been in the studio?
Not exactly the same machine, but yeah, same equipment with same functionality. And in some cases, like same brand name, like another, you know, yeah. So yeah, I think that's so clever and interesting. The VDR does have an archival sound library, and I was able to see the original reels of and you know, all lined up from Morgenrothe on, and see the order that they have them in, the way that this is cataloged. The VDR also has what's called the Handeapparat library. This is like a library that Eimert and other composers built while they were there to have like a sort of personal stock of interesting recordings at that time. So maybe you've heard the anecdote about Ligeti coming to the VDR and having this wonderful shock and being able to listen to all of this wonderful music from the 50s that he hadn't yet been able to hear. So it's pretty interesting to see like not only the library of the electronic compositions, but also the library of acoustic and other avant-garde compositions that they maintained and deemed important context for their work, right? All of this material has really been digitized and is available at the VDR as part of their archival library. So I've been able to listen to it and see the physical object, but when I listen to it, I'm listening to a digitization of it.
I wonder if you just sort of the scope of your project here at the Community Center. I mean, it deals with the WDR, but just sort of the scope beyond even what we were able to talk about in this talk, or really the talk. I mean, I'm sure it could take a book in and of itself. So I just wanted to hear more about your year here and the kinds of work you're doing at this Community Center.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm really writing this book with themes of invisible collaboration, with themes of electronic music driving the development of acoustic music, and showing how composers are working together, and that the problems and breakdowns of the electronic studio really inspire further development in acoustic music. So I have chapters on additive synthesis. I have a chapter on statistical form, which Stockhausen contextualized or tried to contextualize entirely in this lineage from Webern to Debussy, using Je in particular, which was a total smokescreen. You know, like what's really going on here is information theory and electronic music. And I have a chapter about cage and the prepared piano. We think about cage being important for aleatory, which is sort of true, but he was actually important much earlier in the early 50s for the prepared piano sounds. The composers really idolized and fetishized the prepared piano as another one of these moments where all traditional sounds were sort of bypassed and we had all these new sonic possibilities. They loved his use of proportions too, and they really dug that. So there's a chapter about cage. There's a chapter about the speech synthesis and the phonetics and compositions like Anagramma by Kagel and Aventure and Nouvelle Aventure by Ligeti. A lot of these sort of avant-garde text, theater, music compositions Barrio's in here, Cage, Basur. There's a whole sort of class of really kind of experimental phonetics pieces that grow up in the 60s, I think also as a result of the Meyer-Epler discourses around phonetics in music. So that's sort of the analytical evidence of the book inside this larger frame of reclaiming post-wartime technology. Yeah. Yes.
Another question from online, from Nima Hamidi. Maybe this is a question for CCRMA people. Dr. Iverson, do you think that invisible collaboration still exists or the process has changed? Who are the invisible collaborators now, if any?
This is a question for CCRMA people. And to be totally honest, I am totally nervous about giving my talk here because I'm talking to y'all about how y'all work, and that's really presumptuous. So what do you think? We'll put it back on you. Does invisible collaboration still exist?
Yeah, but I think it's very different. Simply because of the part. So I'm using programs written by other people I've never met, and I can't do what I did without that.
Mm-hmm.
But the functionality is, that relationship is different because they're functionally easy. It's easier for me to use. I don't have to go, hey, I have no idea what happens when I turn this knob, and someone explain it to me. Or I don't have to always do that, so I think that's a bit different. I don't know what you think, Matt.
I think there's a lot of visible collaboration happening here in the center.
Yeah.
I mean, the question to me is, why should it be invisible? And it seems like it's a sort of a political question in terms of the composer defining his stature and being autonomous, as you're problematizing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, to some degree, we're still in that model, and to some degree, especially around here, there's a lot of nice composers who are very happy to explicitly and visibly collaborate. And
It's a basic thing of program notes. You're more likely to see more than one name on a piece.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's fine with that. That seems perfectly obvious, where that just seems to be something people are not comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who's helped a lot of composers over my career, it's easy to kind of take a cynical view of the technician as the one who actually does the work, and then the composer who comes in and arranges it using 12-tone techniques.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a funny, and then takes all the credit. That's a trope that rings true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's also becoming a lot more narrow in the sense of a lot of people are being trained both in engineering and composition at the same time. And so while it might not have been the case, 20, 30, 40 years ago, now it's definitely becoming a lot more present in some circles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great point. I think Stockhausen, for instance, was really able to claim his authority as a composer of electronic music, also Gottfried Michael Koenig, because they possessed so much technical knowledge themselves. They were really their own technician, right? So it's quite a different thing, and Stockhausen was able to sort of garner a lot of technical knowledge that bolstered his artistic rise and his claiming of authority as the leader of the studio, right? He was always skeptical that Eimer didn't really possess that technical competence and therefore wasn't really the leader of the studio. They kind of had a fight about this in print in the 70s, for instance, right? Who was really the leader? So I think you're right that the situation is somewhat changed when the composer actually possesses more technical ability, right? But Georgina Bourne's book, Rationalizing Culture, which is an ethnographic study of IRCAM in the 1980s, is also like really fantastic for showing this scenario where, famous composers came and had grand plans, or even didn't have grand plans, right? And it was their tutors who knew how to use the hardware and the software and who were making the adjustments that were aiming for these, timbral synthesis ideas and so on. So
my favorite vignette of that relationship is when a friend of mine, who I guess I won't name, who's in here, a musical assistant, as you're describing, a composer said, "Can you make it sound more like the voice of God?"
Sure, just let me adjust a few things, right? Yeah, I had an interview with Gottfried Michael Koenig last summer, and I wanted to really draw him out. I actually invited another person who'd worked as a technician at the WDR, and he declined to interview with me, but because I really wanted to know what it was like to be the one who really knows how to work on the machines, and then someone like Ligeti comes in and has like no experience, right? And how do you work with that? Because I had this theory that like it's really the technician doing everything, right? Like from Bourne's book, and just stands to reason, right? Koenig really pulled me back a little bit from that thesis, and he said, you know, I never did the work of the composer for them. We could discuss like what would be the components of the sound of the voice of God, right? And then I would send them back to like do more sketches and do more experiments. Or maybe like they would have a specific idea and I would help them try that out and then make adjustments, right? But he said that it was always that sort of dialogical relationship, and I thought that was very interesting. I found some evidence archivally of that at the Paul Zacher in the Kagel collection. Kagel came from Argentina to Cologne in '57 and right into the studio on a DAAD grant, and began studying with Meyer Epler almost simultaneously as well, but has this wonderful notebook that's so scientific. He like sets out a hypothesis and tries an experiment and then writes down the results of it. And there are like 70 typed single-spaced pages of this. So he's really like setting up these experiments so that he'll learn how to use the equipment, what does what sort of adjustments make what sort of effects. And I love that sort of laboratory experimentation. And I think that, you know, this is, I'm sure, not a surprise to you guys, but, you know, anyone who's sort of new to the technology, whether it's computer music based or analog, has to have that kind of period of open experimentation before working with a technician even really becomes helpful, right? You have to have some kind of knowledge, right?
Does the reverse happen? Like, so Ligeti sort of realized his limit and jumped out.
Mm-hmm.
But used particularly the stuff we've done with Cumming to actually implement a very radical approach to acoustic instruments.
That's right.
Perception of
Yeah.
acoustic instruments. And I'm just wondering how much, say, Stockhausen, in those same letters, is talking about something like Cruisespiel that sets him up on an investigation of timbre, using timbre as an organizational principle for serialism,
Mm-hmm.
and how much he relates that to what he's also doing at the same time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the composers, Stockhausen, but also the older generation, posit this really immanent logic where Webern is the most direct precursor who basically already was composing total serialism and was already isolating these wonderful sound objects at which timbre could really speak and be heard in a new way, right? Which of course is not at all true, you know, really, with how it's not consistent exactly with what Webern was thinking, right? But it was their interpretation of it. Schoenberg and Klangfarbenmelodie is this wonderful sort of precursor, right? And then they posit this lineage that keeps going back to early sort of 1920s instrument builders and inventors, Busoni, you know, and they continue on back. They build this whole web that makes it seem like electronic music is sort of the inevitable conclusion. So I think they definitely did think that the electronic music project was continuous with everything that had inspired them, everything that they wanted to claim from the history of Western art music. And because the electronic music studio is really the site where the serial ideas are most deeply developed and worked out, there was that continuity for them, right? But there were also these breakdowns, and Ligeti is a fantastic example, right? His piece Electronique number 3 imagined additive synthesis for 48 sine tones at a time, right? Which, if one could do it, would perhaps add really a lot of complexity comparing with Stockhausen's 5 or 6 sine tones in Studier 1 and 2, right? But it really wasn't possible. We're working in a 4-channel system, and you know, to make 48 things, you're doing a ton of re-recording. There's a ton of tape noise by the end. It's just totally impractical, right? Based on synchronization, based on tape noise, all kinds of technical difficulties, right? So what does Ligeti do? He steps out of the studio and he writes Atmosphere, which uses 48 or something like that, individual orchestral voices, right? And treats each instrument as its own line, right? And it's this sort of acoustic composing out of additive synthesis. I love this sort of one-to-one comparison, and Ligeti's music, I think, is the best example of it. But so I think, where the composers saw this sort of imminent, inevitable logic that was historically conditioned, what they didn't anticipate were these breakdowns, right? And it's those breakdowns and problems and difficulties and technological inadequacies that prompt them to try again, right, in acoustic music. And that's how electronic music mediates, right, or forces on the development of the whole Western art music project, right?
I've been asking them for a while. There's actually one chap who has a channel, I guess, called Computing Sound, just points out that there are two very interesting videos on YouTube. WDR Studio for Electronic and Musical Code 1, 2, and 202, which addresses the point about if there's any the original equipment.
Yeah, that's right. It's since been put away, but you can see videos online with the technician leading you through how some of the technologies work. Yeah, very cool.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.